Good afternoon, dear friends. I'm very glad to see you here. And it is an honor and privilege to open this special meeting with Niall Ferguson. Our distinguished guest today is a native of Glasgow, Scotland, and now a professor of history at Harvard, who uses his powerful talents to give a reader a highly tactile sense of history. He is, as the London School of Economics website puts it, one of the most eminent scholars. Niall Ferguson is the author of highly acclaimed books, and his articles, lectures, and videos on economic and financial history, history of empires, and history of the Western civilization are not only entertaining, but also controversial and interesting. I remember something that Niall Ferguson said a couple of years ago about civilization, the West, and the rest. The book is partly designed so a 17-year-old boy or girl will get a lot of history in a very digestible way and be able to relate it to it. I have a sense that my son and daughter's generation is not well served by the way they are taught history. They don't have a big picture. They don't have a big picture. So I wanted to write a book what would be really accessible to them. Well, Niall, look at the audience, young people. You will have plenty to talk about. But let me start by this meeting with the first question, with the first open question. The idea of progress among most Chilean liberals seems to be exclusively connected with economic development. So advocates of free society focus the argument on efficiency and economic outcomes. In the Great Degeneration, your idea of progress is not so simple, of progress and of free society also. You talk about 4 black boxes that explain progress in Western societies, and especially in most successful countries: democracy, capitalism, rule of law, and civil society. So how could we promote free society, even free market economy, beyond efficiency and economic outcomes?
Wow. That's a tall order on a Friday afternoon when you've already talked all day. Let me first thank you all for being here. Assuming you haven't been forced into being here and are here of your own volition, and I'm never really sure with a young audience. I mean, maybe you're all here under duress. But assuming that you're here of your own volition, it's incredibly touching. I'm honored, flattered, pleased, excited to have you here. One of the problems about being an academic, a professor, is that you have a kind of captive audience. In my case, of Harvard students. You don't often get the chance to talk to the same age group anywhere else, because Harvard really monopolizes you. And I try, wherever possible, to interact with young people. A lot of you are about the age of my older kids, because in the end, it's your world ultimately. I mean, I'm 50 now. And in Glasgow, average life expectancy is 51. Not really. But I have to say you're the future. And so it's very, very important that those of us who teach history for a living convey to your age group what unfreedom is, what the opposite of progress is, and in particular, help you to understand the nature of liberty itself. If you get the impression, as your question implied, that liberty just means the free market, privatization, then you're missing a huge range of different dimensions in which personal freedom really, really matters. And I suppose one way of understanding this is through the study of history. I've spent most of my life looking at various different forms of unfree society. I began my career thinking about Nazi Germany, the origins of one of the worst regimes in all of history, if not the worst. I've spent time studying the communist regimes, especially in Eastern Europe. More recently, I've been doing work that has touched on China in the Mao era. I wrote a little bit on the Cultural Revolution when I was working on a book called War of the World. So history is a way of encountering or experiencing at second hand a whole range of conditions of unfreedom. The better to understand what freedom really means. I'm also very lucky because I'm married to one of the most amazing women in the entire world, who is actually much more interesting than me. And when she comes, you'll need a much bigger room. Ayaan Hirsi Ali was born in Somalia into a fairly conservative Muslim family. And she, as a Muslim woman, has lived on freedom and understands better than I think I ever can what freedom is. Because she had to fight for it, had to take massive personal risks for freedom, had to break with her own parents to be free, defy her father, flee an arranged marriage, start a completely new life in the Netherlands. Started as a cleaner before she could really speak Dutch, and ended up being a member of parliament in the Netherlands. An amazing achievement in its own right. But that wasn't enough. My wife's pursuit of freedom ultimately led her to question her own religion and to question the claims of Islam, particularly with respect to the rights of women. That bid for freedom led her to face death threats, multiple fatwas. From my perspective, her life is the personification of the struggle for freedom. That struggle for freedom can take many, many different forms. But right at its heart, it is about very fundamental liberties. Not just the liberty to trade and make money, that's important, but it's not by any means the most important. The freedom to think, the freedom to speak, the freedom to represent your ideas in a public space or at a university, even if the overwhelming majority of people disagree with them. The freedom to do that without fear. The freedom to write what you like. The freedom to meet with and associate with whomever you like. The fundamental freedoms that were fought for over centuries in the Western world are very often taken for granted by the people who've grown up with them, who were born with them, who never ever thought for a minute what it might be like not to have them. And so I'm hoping that a gathering like this is part of a worldwide effort just to keep reminding ourselves as a species, by talking to young people, about the most important thing. Freedom is the most important thing. And you should be always on your guard for attempts to limit that freedom, dressed up with all kinds of spurious justifications. Academic life in the United States is under a major assault. by people who would limit the freedom of speech and replace academic freedom with academic responsibility, who would have everybody check their privilege before they speak to make sure that they are speaking for some suitably victimized minority rather than just for themselves. I'm here to tell you that freedom is constantly under attack. Not just from the right, and not just from the left, but from all sides. And that is, for me, the most important lesson of history.
Hi, my name is Domingo. Professor, thank you so much for coming to Chile, for being here with us. It's an honor, it really is. I wonder about your position regarding freedom and religious liberty. I know you're an atheist, and so is your wife, and I know she is very vocal about it. But I've also heard you speak and write about how specifically Christianism has a number of advantages that are very good. Even if you don't agree with the theological arguments, you think it may be good that people are Christians under certain circumstances. So I wonder, what do you think is the place for religion in freedom, in liberty? And how would you face, say, certain religions that may limit that? As, for example, Islam as it stands today, because I don't, So, yes.
This is a great question, and a hugely important one. It's no secret that I'm an atheist. I was actually brought up an atheist. My parents, so it's not like I made some clever choice for myself. My parents left the Church of Scotland, I think mainly out of disgust with the sectarianism in the Glasgow of the 1950s and 60s, when Protestants and Catholics had their own miniature version of Northern Ireland going on. And my parents are both scientists and in many ways believers in the principles of the Scottish Enlightenment. And so I was brought up in an atmosphere of self-confident rationalism. And my mother would say, look, life is a cosmic accident. After death, there's nothing. You might as well enjoy it. And it was kind of bracing to have no consolations about the afterlife, and bracing to be told there is no moral arbiter out there beyond nature. And yet I came to realize over time that although my parents had dispensed with religious faith formally, they retained the entire ethical framework of Calvinism almost uninterruptedly from start to finish. And so I was, in fact, brought up, and so this microphone's a bit weak. I was brought up in a Calvinist household that didn't believe in God. So I'm actually an atheist Calvinist, or Calvinist atheist. And I've come to realize that ethical framework that they gave me, even if it didn't have the sanction of a supreme being, was incredibly important to me and has determined many of my actions, I hope most of my actions, through my life. Nature is wonderful, but it doesn't really give you a good moral framework for choosing between good and evil. And I don't honestly believe that experiments with atheism on a national scale have been a great advertisement for that particular non-faith. Indeed, I've kind of become recently a little bit uncomfortable with the more militant atheists who feel as if they have to proselytize for atheism like it's its own form of faith. I don't think I'll ever have religious faith. I think you can't acquire that at age 50 unless something very miraculous happens. But I think I can see the enormous importance of the ethical frameworks that religion provides. And I think I can also see that there are good and bad ethical frameworks. And if you had to choose in an imperfect world, I would sooner that the Christian ethical framework were the dominant one than the ethical framework that is currently espoused by the representatives of political Islam, who are transforming Islam into an ideology as dangerous, indeed in many ways more dangerous even than communism was at its height. It's a huge challenge to the freedom of conscience. It's a huge challenge to the equality of the sexes. It's a huge challenge to almost all that Western civilization stands for. And those of us who lack religious faith need to make some alliances here. This was an argument my wife made in her last book, Nomad. We need to make common cause with those whose values we can identify ourselves with. Christ was an amazing man. Christ's teaching is extraordinary when you reflect on it. The decision to mix his teaching in various different testaments with the Old Testament of the Jews was a pretty extraordinary idea. Now, I'm not saying that Christianity hasn't done bad stuff. Let's not lose sight of the huge religious wars, the last embers of which my parents were witnessing in the west of Scotland, even in the 1950s. Let's not forget the 17th century. Let's not forget the wars of the 16th century. Let's not forget the things that were done in the name of Christ by the intolerant missionaries who spread out around the world, convinced that the heathen should become converted to Christianity. Let's not forget all that. But let's recognize that at its very core, Christianity teaches some very, very powerful and important things that restrain us as individuals and make us aware, ultimately, of the need to make choices and to understand that evil exists. So my position's wonderfully ambivalent. I'm the unbeliever who believes. I'm the guy who can't pray, who periodically shows up in church. In the end, there is a cultural battle unfolding in the world today. And it's at, I think, a relatively early stage. And those of us in the Western world haven't quite, I think, come to terms with the nature of that battle. And until we do, we're going to be losing it. Judaism is also good. Just wanted to throw that in.
You said a while ago that freedom was the most important thing to fight for. And I believe that in the 19th century, maybe there was this huge enemy, kings and the how do you call monarchy. That was the huge enemy of freedom. Maybe in the 20th century, the communism or whatever, all of these regimes. So today, I believe it's very difficult because we don't have a visual, enemy. So how do you really make people to understand that this is such an essential fight, especially when there is no enemy around?
Oh, there is an enemy. There are plenty of them, in fact. I mentioned one already, and I'll make one more reference to it. The project of political Islam, some people call it fundamentalism and extremism, but I think these are euphemisms. We're really talking about an attempt to use the teachings of Muhammad as the basis for a political order. This attempt poses a massive threat to individual freedom, and especially, by the way, to the freedom of women. And this is a threat that is growing extremely rapidly. It may not seem obvious here in Chile, but the rapid explosion of political Islam, not just in the Middle East, but in North Africa, as far away as in Malaysia and Indonesia, of course in Afghanistan and Pakistan, and in Europe, right in the heart of the country I grew up in. This is a very huge challenge, and it is not going to diminish. It is only going to grow. It has not only demographics behind it, but it has a highly effective mode of spreading. The message of jihad is spreading as rapidly as the message of Bolshevism and communism spread 100 years ago. Maybe more rapidly because the technology makes it spread very fast. So that's a threat. The second threat is, I think, implicit in some of the things I've said elsewhere. If the world's biggest economy, which by some measures it already is China's, and China is run by the Communist Party, a one-party state in which there is no democracy, then freedom is threatened. Because however much the Chinese have come to believe in the market and abandon economic planning, they sure as hell don't believe in freedom as I understand it. They don't believe in the freedom of speech. They don't believe in the freedom of expression. They don't believe in the freedom of association. So that's a threat. Then there are all the kind of not so authoritarian but not so democratic regimes that are kind of somewhere in the middle. Take a look at what is happening in Ukraine right now. Right under our noses, for the first time since the end of World War II, a sovereign state is being partitioned. Russia annexed Crimea. It is at the moment in possession of a large part of southeastern Ukraine, entirely as a result of the use of military force. So the threats are, in fact, quite numerous. And not so very far from here, there are states of unfreedom. They kind of look democratic, but I don't know how free Venezuela is. I've been to Venezuela, not very free. Being an opponent of the Chavez regime and its Maduro successor is a great way to land in jail. That's my definition of a lack of freedom, when your views get you in jail. I know it doesn't feel like the Cold War, because in the Cold War there seemed to be this big monolithic bad guy, the Soviet Union and its satellites. But it seems to me that in practice, today freedom is as threatened, and maybe more threatened, than it was even at the height of the Cold War. And if it's bad now, I'm pretty confident it will be worse when you are my age. Cheerful.
Okay.
So why do you think nations go from freedom to back to unfreedom? I'm from Russia, and you may understand this question kind of something that I'm trying to make sense of recently. Thank you.
Well, it's delightful to have a Russian here. I've been often to Russia, and I have watched with sadness the reversal of freedom. I can remember being in St. Petersburg, I think, in 1990, before the dissolution of the Soviet Union, but after the fall of the Berlin Wall. And I can remember one night in a bar with a group of Russian students, after much vodka had been consumed. The band played a parody of the old Soviet national anthem in the style of the stripper. And everybody stood and drunkenly sang. It was one of those supremely ironic moments. And I remember thinking, it's over. The Cold War is over, because Russians can make fun of the Soviet national anthem. Well, it became economically pretty rocky after that, as you may remember. And suddenly, we found ourselves with a former KGB operative as president, and things have been going in the wrong direction in terms of freedom pretty much since Mr. Putin came to power in the Kremlin. And I think that's sad, because I think Russians are as capable of freedom as the Scots, who also drink a great deal, but also understand freedom. Why does it happen? Why do things go in the wrong direction? One of the great thinkers on this subject was the Frenchman Alexis de Tocqueville. And I'm a big Tocqueville fan. Everybody should read Democracy in America and its counterpart, The Old Regime and the Revolution. Tocqueville's central idea is that there is a fundamental trade-off between liberty and equality. And in democracy, it's not too difficult to persuade people to choose equality over liberty. And there are other ways of persuading them to dump liberty. Tocqueville's central argument was that you need a whole bunch of different things to stop democracies sliding away from freedom. When he goes to the United States in the 1830s, he's amazed to find that there's this incredible structure of voluntary associations and this amazing network of religious sects and churches and this fascinating culture of lawyers and local politics. And he says, wow, the Americans have this way of making democracy work that keeps freedom intact because it limits the power of the central government and it limits the ability of the majority to vote for something really dumb. And then he comes back to France and he goes, oh, gee. There's this wonderful passage quoted in The Great Degeneration when Tocqueville says, he's trying to explain the difference between the Americans and the French. And he says, when the Americans think that there's a problem with alcohol abuse, they create prohibition societies in all the different towns of America, and they campaign in their little associations against alcohol abuse. But if a Frenchman decides that there's a problem with alcohol abuse, he writes a letter to the central government in Paris asking it to take measures to close down all the bars. And that difference to Tocqueville is really a crucial one. That the Americans in the 19th century instinctively tried to solve their own problems through the medium of civil society, not through the central government, and whereas the French would always expect the central government to act. L'Ancien Régime et la Révolution is a meditation on why the French Revolution failed, why ultimately all the talk of liberté came to nothing and a hugely bloody tyranny was installed in a matter of a few years. I think it gets to the heart of the problem. It's not difficult, particularly if you control the media, to persuade people with a mix of chauvinism, nationalism, populism, and any other bogus ism that you can think of, that individual freedom is a bad thing. And it would be better to limit the freedom of that guy and you, just because their freedom poses a threat to Mother Russia. That argument about the ease with which freedom can be undermined in a democracy, particularly in a pseudo-democracy where there isn't civil society, is a really compelling one. What was Russia's problem? Dead easy to explain. Russia hastily dismantled the one-party state, hastily dismantled its empire, rushed into the market economy in the name of shock therapy, rushed into democracy with none of the other institutions in place, and particularly without a civil society that was capable of sustaining the new institutions that were being created. And it turned out that democracy plus shock therapy in that context really quickly produced kleptocracy and the epic theft of the century that was the so-called privatization of the Yeltsin years. You know, one of the great delights about teaching the work I teach is that the answers are usually out there, and I don't have to think of them myself. I just need to go find them, whether it's in Tocqueville or in Adam Smith or in any of the great thinkers about Western freedom. We figured this all out a long time ago. We just have to keep reminding ourselves of their messages and trying to apply them, even in Russia.
You have a question there.
Hello? Yes, Professor, do you see any similarities between this assault on freedom and the one from the 70s, the late 70s? And is that the case, how much can we learn from Lady Thatcher how to expand and advance freedom on a global scale?
Well, it's always a pleasure to talk about Margaret Thatcher. I don't know if you can readily imagine what a terrific mess Britain was in by the mid-1970s. The International Monetary Fund had to come in to bail out Britain in 1976. There was a catastrophic level of industrial unrest. When the refuse collectors went on strike in the mid-70s, I can remember the rats in the streets of Glasgow. It was almost credible, and this may surprise a Chilean audience, it was almost credible at times in the 1970s that there might be a coup in Britain. And the idea of some military or military intelligence coup was seriously discussed, and people worried about that. That was how bad it was. Margaret Thatcher illustrates a really important point, which is highly relevant to your work. She didn't just descend from heaven. At the beginning of her political career, Margaret Thatcher was in fact a standard, middle-of-the-road, not very clued up, conservative wet, to use the terminology of the time. There were wets and dries. And she was wet. In her first incarnation as a minister, she did all kinds of things that were very un-Thatcherite. And then came the think tanks. And the Institute of Economic Affairs and the Center for Policy Studies and others in the course of the 1970s, when morale was really low in the Conservative Party, did an immense amount of work redefining and rethinking the fundamental principles of a free society. And sometimes it meant making Margaret Thatcher read Hayek. You probably know the story about an interview when early in her leadership she was asked what she believed in. And she reached into her handbag and pulled out Hayek's Constitution of Liberty, slammed it down on the table and said, "This is what we believe in." So the education of Margaret Thatcher was a hugely important moment in British history because she came to believe, I mean, she was a scientist by training, she had not read this stuff before, she came to believe that there were fundamental economic and political principles that could not be compromised on. When she became leader of the Conservative Party back in 1977, I was 13 and the Sex Pistols had just released God Save the Queen. It was an amazing turning point. Even to a 13-year-old boy, there was something extraordinary about a woman leading the Conservative Party and a woman who seemed uncompromising on the key issues of the time, industrial relations, inflation, the Cold War. Because she was convinced, she was capable of being consistent, even when the polls went against her. We easily forget that from 1979 until 1982, almost everything went against her. The economic reforms of the early Thatcher years were incredibly painful. Getting inflation under control, I've just been at your central bank, it's under control, you'll be glad to hear. But getting inflation under control when it has been up to 22%, as it had been in the UK in the mid-1970s, was really painful. Unemployment went up. There was unrest. The miners went on strike. It was deeply, deeply difficult. And enormous numbers of people, including people within the government, were panicking. But Margaret Thatcher, because she understood she was doing the right thing, held firm. just as she held firm in some of the darkest days of the Cold War after the deployments of the cruise and Pershing missiles, when the campaign for nuclear disarmament was holding massive rallies. You know, there were lots of demonstrations in the streets of London and other cities against the Thatcher government, and there was a good deal of anxiety. But she had no doubt. I wrote a book just after she died. It's the fastest book I've ever written. I wrote it, I think, in about 2 days of feverish writing. And I called it Always Right, because it suddenly hit me that she had been pretty much always right. Even when she finally lost power, which was ultimately over Europe, she had been right. She was right. It was mad to join the exchange rate mechanism. It would have been even madder to join the monetary union. Being right in the sense of having the correct analysis and the correct remedy isn't easy. And very few politicians, because of the very nature of politics, figure this stuff out by themselves. It requires think tanks. It requires, yes, intellectuals to do that foundation building. In the United States right now where I live, a process of reconstruction is gradually getting underway as conservatives try to learn from the defeat of 2 years ago, which was in many ways self-inflicted. But it's early days, and it reminds me vividly of the early 70s in Britain. We're beginning to think again about our message and how better to communicate it to people. I think that's the necessary first stage. There will not be an American Thatcher or another Reagan for a bit, because we haven't done our homework yet. We haven't done the job. And I believe a similar kind of job is needed here. You have to work hard to make sure the message is not only intellectually coherent, but plausible to the ordinary people who will never read Hayek. And sometimes that plausibility is the thing that we lovers of freedom don't get right.
Can I just make a brief interjection there? Thank you for your question. And of course, Neil, you've enlightened us once again. On that note, you mentioned think tanks and think tanks in Great Britain. Thanks to the work with Axel Kaiser, we have struck a deal with the Institute of Economic Affairs, and we have all their material at our disposal. And of course, today maybe none of you read books, you actually read things on the tablet or whatever, and so that's the next stage maybe. But the first product of this joint effort with the Institute of Economic Affairs is this little booklet. And it's very easy. There's a summary at the back. It's only 3 pages long. And if that entices you, which I'm sure it will, you can read the rest of the book pretty quickly, and it will teach you, I think, just about everything you want to know about these subjects. And it's a good introduction to then go on to more, perhaps, enlightening reading options like the ones that Neil has suggested today. So this is the first product. Rafael translated it, so we have become the official translator for the Institute of Economic Affairs, and so we're going to be working together. And he's done this wonderful job, and it's just been published, so take it home with you tonight. Look at it. You can possibly chuck it out if you have it on your tablet or whatever, but just take it with you tonight and briefly look at it. And I think it'll enthuse you as it has me.
Okay. We have 2 more questions here. Yeah.
Thank you so much. My name is Gabriel, and I have 2 questions for you. I would like you to touch this point related with China. You were mentioning China before, and actually I had the opportunity to read before from several scholars saying that one of the key points of success of China is the fact that there is a central power which is able to control or to marginalize the frictions that might be in the society due to liberalism and in both the economic and the political fields. I mean, the simple fact that as a citizen, probably in a system of one person, one vote, I can try to vote and get my own decision, which is countering probably your interest as well. So there is a tension in that. And then they say actually systems like China can make a sort of planning of the economy for the future and trying to control with a certain degree the development. So it's in one extent is something that these same authors or scholars are criticizing from the American political and economic system. This is my first question. The second one. No, it's just briefly to mention the current political situation here and the reforms from President Michelle Bachelet. That's it. Okay.
Well, since time is short and I have to catch a plane, I'll keep it short. It's a great mistake to think that there is some advantage that China enjoys from being a one-party state. In fact, if one goes to Beijing and talks to the people running China, they will be the first to tell you how very problematic this really is in practice. But they know, and they're right, that they cannot possibly transition to democracy anytime soon because they don't have the rule of law. They don't even have the beginnings of the rule of law, and they don't want to make the mistakes that they saw made in Russia. There's a strong awareness in China of what could go wrong if they get the sequencing wrong. So the aim in China is rule of law first, and then gradually move in the direction of a more representative system of government, but very, very gradually. And I don't blame them for their caution. There have been enough explosions of political instability in Chinese history to make them wise to tread carefully. But they don't see it as an advantage. It's just naive Western intellectuals who think there's a Chinese model of state capitalism. The Chinese can't wait to get away from state capitalism. The desire to privatize the state-owned enterprises is very strong there. And indeed, if one looks closely at the small print of the most recent reforms at the third plenum, the direction in China is very clearly away from the state towards the market, sometimes quite strikingly so. So I think we should really push back against this idea that the Chinese have some admirable, enviable model. Churchill said it well. Democracy is the worst of all possible political systems, apart from all the others that have been tried from time to time. And that is still true, and I think the Chinese actually believe it and know that ultimately that must be their destination, even if it's only 50 years down the line. I'm not going to get deeply into the comments, the question you asked at the end, because I think when Ivy League professors fly into countries that they've been to only once before and start pontificating about the detailed reforms that a government is proposing without having read the legislation, they just come across like Paul Krugman. And I'm really reluctant to do that. All I have said, and I'll say it again, I've said it before, is that this does not look like an optimal moment in Chilean economic history to embark on a tax hike on corporations, given the steep drop in business confidence there has been. And it does not look like the right way to address the problem of inequality to try to hammer private education and take the metaphorical skates off the feet of those people who are enjoying a good education. So I'm inclined to think that this government has two misconceived reforms, but I'm no expert. And I've voiced these views very tentatively, and I hope modestly, in the spirit of international comparison. Before you do stuff to what has been a hugely successful country, really the miracle of Latin America, I think you at least need to look very carefully at international best practice on taxation, on education. There are lessons to be learned. Plenty of countries in Europe tried social democracy in all kinds of different forms. The UK tried comprehensive education, waged war on private schools. Tax rates have been increased a lot. Guess what? Especially corporate taxes in many different countries. Has the government looked seriously at the experience of other countries? Just a hunch, but no. So that's as far as I'll go.
Okay.
To understand the nature of liberty itself. If you get the impression, as your question implied, that liberty just means the free market, privatization, then you're missing a huge range of different dimensions in which personal freedom really, really matters. And I suppose one way of understanding this is through the study of history. I've spent most of my life looking at various different forms of unfree society. I began my career thinking about Nazi Germany, the origins of one of the worst regimes in all of history, if not the worst. I've spent time studying the communist regimes, especially in Eastern Europe. More recently, I've been doing work that has touched on China in the Mao era. I wrote a little bit on the Cultural Revolution when I was working on a book called War of the World. So history is a way of encountering or experiencing, but assuming that you're here of your own volition. It's incredibly touching. I'm honored, flattered, pleased, excited to have you here. One of the problems about being an academic, a professor, is that you have a kind of captive audience, in my case of Harvard students. You don't often get the chance to talk to the same age group anywhere else, because Harvard really monopolizes you. And I try, wherever possible, to interact with young people. A lot of you are about the age of my older kids, because in the end, it's your world ultimately. I mean, I'm 50 now, and in Glasgow, average life expectancy is 51. Not really. But I have to say you're the future, and so it's very, very important that those of us who teach history for a living convey to your age group what unfreedom is, what the opposite of progress is, and in particular, help you to
good afternoon, dear friends. I'm very glad to see you here. And it is an honor and a privilege to open this special meeting with Niall Ferguson. Our distinguished guest today is a native of Glasgow, Scotland, and now a professor of history at Harvard, who uses his powerful talents to give a reader a highly tactile sense of history. He is, as the London School of Economics website puts it, one of the most eminent scholars. Niall Ferguson is the author of highly acclaimed books, and his articles, lectures, and videos on economic and financial history, history of empires, and history of the Western civilization are not only entertaining, but also controversial and interesting. I remember something that Niall Ferguson said a couple of years ago about civilization, the West, and the rest. The book is partly designed so a 17-year-old boy or girl will get a lot of history in a very digestible way and be able to relate it to it. I have a sense that my son and daughter's generation is not well served by the way they are taught history. They don't have a big picture. They don't have the big picture. So I wanted to write a book what would be really accessible to them. Well, Neil, look at the audience, young people. You will have plenty to talk about. But let me start by this meeting with the first question, with the first open question. The idea of progress among most Chilean liberals seems to be exclusively connected with economic development. So, advocates of free society focus the argument on efficiency and economic outcomes. In the Great Degeneration, your idea of progress is not so simple. Of progress and of free society also. You talk about 4 black boxes that explain progress in Western societies, and especially in most successful countries: democracy, capitalism, rule of law, and civil society. So how could we promote free society, even free market economy, beyond efficiency and economic outcomes? Everything
Wow. That's a tall order on a Friday afternoon when you've already talked all day. Let me first thank you all for being here. Assuming you haven't been forced into being here and are here of your own volition, and I'm never really sure with a young audience. I mean, maybe you're all here under duress. Experiencing at second hand a whole range of conditions of unfreedom. The better to understand what freedom really means. I'm also very lucky because I'm married to one of the most amazing women in the entire world, who is actually much more interesting than me. And when she comes, you'll need a much bigger room. Ayaan Hirsi Ali was born in Somalia into a fairly conservative Muslim family. And she, as a Muslim woman, has lived on freedom and understands better than I think I ever can what freedom is. Because she had to fight for it, had to take massive personal risks for freedom, had to break with her own parents to be free, defy her father, flee an arranged marriage, start a completely new life in the Netherlands. Started as a cleaner before she could really speak Dutch, and ended up being a member of parliament in the Netherlands.